Hook. Ash Hollow. She had 22 seconds before that man bled out on a warehouse floor, and the people pointing guns at her were the ones who'd just fired her. Claire Donovan had been dismissed, humiliated, and pushed out of Ash Hollow Medical Center like she was nothing, like 8 years of her life meant nothing, like the fact that she'd once kept soldiers breathing in the middle of a war zone meant absolutely nothing. And now, 4 armed operators in a pitch-black shipyard were screaming at her to save one of their own. No equipment, no team, no time. The man on the ground had maybe 90 seconds of blood pressure left. Claire looked at the gun. She looked at the wound. She made her choice. If this story hits you the way I think it will, stay with me until the end. Like this video, drop a comment, and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The last patient Claire Donovan treated at Ash Hollow Medical Center was a 63-year-old longshoreman named Pete, who'd crushed 2 fingers under a shipping container and refused to cry about it. She liked Pete. He cracked a joke while she was cleaning the wound, something about how he'd always had too many fingers anyway, and she'd laughed. A real laugh, not the practiced, exhausted version she'd been performing for hospital administrators for the past 8 months. She wrapped his hand with more care than the situation technically required, gave him extra gauze, squeezed his forearm when she told him he was good to go. "You're the only one in this place that actually looks at you," Pete said, pulling his jacket back on. "The rest of them look through you." She didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. That was 11:47 p.m. By midnight, Claire was standing in the break room pulling her name badge off her lanyard for the last time. And Karen Stoltz, the floor supervisor who'd made the past 2 years of Claire's career a slow-motion disaster, was leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed and an expression like she'd just won something small but satisfying. "HR will process your final check by Friday," Karen said. "You'll need to turn in your access card." Claire set the badge on the counter. She didn't throw it. She'd thought about throwing it, had actually rehearsed the gesture in her head during the last half of her shift, imagined the sharp plastic click of it skipping across the linoleum. But when the moment arrived, she just set it down quietly, and that quietness felt more honest somehow. "Is there anything else?" Claire asked. Karen's expression flickered. She'd expected something. Argument, tears, the kind of scene that would let her feel righteous. She got nothing. "No," Karen said. "That's everything." Claire picked up her bag and walked out. The ER corridor at midnight had its own particular flavor of chaos. The overhead lights too bright, the air tasting of antiseptic and old coffee. 2 paramedics wheeling a gurney toward trauma bay, too, while a woman in the waiting area held a sleeping child and stared at the ceiling tiles like they owed her something. Claire had walked this corridor 10,000 times. She knew which floor tiles were cracked, knew the specific squeak of the 3rd trauma bay door, knew the way the heating vent near the nurses' station rattled slightly whenever the wind came in off Grayport Bay. She knew this building the way you only know places you've bled inside. She pushed through the staff exit and stepped into the October night. Grayport in October smelled like the Atlantic, brine and cold stone, and something faintly organic that you never quite got used to and never quite got tired of. The fog had come in off the water, the way it always did this time of year, sitting low over the parking lot in soft gray layers that swallowed the far edge of the lot and made the overhead sodium lights look like moons. She was fishing for her car keys when she saw the vehicles, 2 matte black SUVs parked sideways across the lot exit. No plates. Engines off, but she could feel the warmth still radiating off them, see the faint curl of exhaust. Recent, very recent. Claire stopped walking. She had worked with enough people who drove vehicles like that to understand immediately that this was not a misparked rental. This was not someone's confused GPS. The positioning was deliberate, not blocking one lane but both, the way you positioned vehicles when you wanted to prevent departure and didn't particularly care whether the person you were controlling understood that yet. She took 1 step back toward the hospital entrance. A man stepped out of the fog. Then another. Then 2 more from the far side of the second SUV. They were dressed in civilian clothes, dark jackets, unremarkable boots, but their posture gave them away completely. The way they moved, the spacing between them, the fact that not one of them looked at the ground, or at each other, or at anything except her. She'd worked with people who moved like that. She'd been around people who moved like that for 3 years of her life that she almost never talked about. The one in front was maybe 40, sharp jaw, pale gray eyes that caught the sodium light and gave nothing back. He stopped 8 feet from her, not close enough to feel threatening, exactly close enough to make running feel like a bad idea. "Claire Donovan," he said, not a question. "Who's asking?" "We need a trauma nurse," he said. "Right now. We don't have time to explain everything, and this is not a situation where you have a lot of options." Claire looked at the 4 of them. She looked at the SUVs. She looked back at the hospital entrance, which was now behind all 4 of them. "What happened to asking nicely?" she said. "We asked," he said. "You just weren't there yet." His name, she would learn later, was Reeves. He didn't offer it then. He just stepped aside and gestured toward the nearer SUV with the flat economy of someone who did not expect to be refused and had arranged the situation accordingly. Claire's pulse was steady. That surprised her. Or maybe it didn't, because she'd been trained to function when her pulse was not steady, and the body remembered things the conscious mind tried to forget. "Someone's bleeding," she said. "Yes." "How bad?" Reeves looked at her for a beat. "Bad enough that we came to a hospital parking lot at midnight." She got in the SUV. She didn't ask where they were going. She asked what she was dealing with. The man who sat beside her in the back, younger, dark-haired, with a bandage visible at his neck that hadn't been applied by anyone with medical training, said, "Femoral, high proximal." Claire felt something cold and efficient settle over her thinking. High proximal femoral lacerations were killers. The femoral artery was one of the largest in the body. A serious laceration there could drain a grown man's blood volume in under 3 minutes. Without a vascular clamp, without an OR, without a scrub team, the survival rate dropped into territory that most trauma surgeons refuse to calculate out loud. "How long ago?" 40 minutes. "Has he had any pressure on it?" "Manual. His partner's holding it." "What do you have for supplies?" A pause. "A trauma kit. Field level. IV access?" 2 large bore IVs. "Fluids running?" "Yes." "Blood type?" Another pause, slightly longer. "O negative." "Do you have blood?" "No." Claire looked out the window. They were moving through the industrial waterfront, away from the hospital district, the streetlights thinning, the fog thicker here where it came directly off the bay. She could see the silhouettes of cranes against the sky, the dark skeleton shapes of dry-docked vessels. An abandoned shipyard. Of course. "Tell me his pressure." Last reading was 80/50. "When?" 20 minutes ago. So he'd been in shock for at least 20 minutes, probably longer. His pressure was falling. Without intervention in the next window, she calculated quickly, the way she'd been trained to calculate, the way that had never entirely left her no matter how much she'd wanted it to. He had somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes before the math became irreversible. "When we get there," Claire said, "nobody argues with me. Nobody tells me what I can and can't do. Nobody touches him without my direction. Is that understood?" Reeves, in the front passenger seat, turned just enough to see her in his peripheral vision. "Understood," he said. "And I need light, real light. Whatever you have, mount." The warehouse was vast and cold and smelled of rust and old saltwater and diesel. Tactical lights on tripod stands threw harsh white beams across the concrete floor, creating a pool of brutal illumination in the center of the space. There was a man on the floor at the center of that light. He was big, 6 feet, probably 220, and he was the color of old chalk. Another operator knelt beside him, both hands pressed hard against the upper thigh, and the blood had gone through 2 layers of field dressing and pooled in a dark halo on the concrete around them. His breathing was shallow and fast. His eyes were open but not focused. Claire crossed the space at a controlled walk, running wasted energy and panicked the patient, and dropped to her knees beside him. "What's his name?" "Marcus," the kneeling operator said. His voice was stripped of everything except the flat, held-down terror of someone who'd been watching his teammate die in slow motion for the past 40 minutes. "Marcus." Claire put her hand on the man's jaw and turned his face toward her. His eyes tracked, barely. "I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you. Can you hear me?" His lips moved. Not quite words. "That's enough." She looked at the operator holding pressure. "On my count, you're going to shift your hands exactly where I put mine. Not before, not after. Exactly when I say. If you move early, we lose him. Do you understand?" The man nodded. His hands were shaking. "What's your name?" "Garrett." "Garrett, look at me." She waited until he did. "You've kept him alive for 40 minutes. That's the hardest part. Now, let me finish it." She opened the trauma kit with one hand while she assessed the wound with the other. The kit was military grade, solid. Tourniquet, hemostatic gauze, chest seals, a CAT, a SOF, TTW. A pair of trauma shears. Someone had packed this thoughtfully. Whoever had packed it had not anticipated a wound this high on the thigh, because a tourniquet was geometrically useless above the inguinal crease. She'd known that before she opened the kit. She'd been calculating alternatives since the car. "I need the longest piece of fabric you can give me right now," she said without looking up. "A shirt, a jacket, anything." Movement behind her. 30 seconds later, someone pressed a field jacket into her hands. She worked. The specific mechanics of what she did in the next 11 minutes were not beautiful, and they were not clean. She used hemostatic gauze packed tight into the wound while Garrett maintained pressure exactly as directed. She improvised a junctional compression using the jacket, folded to create a firm bolster, and directed two of the operators to maintain downward force with their combined body weight in a rotation that she called like she was running an OR. Harder. No, more toward his hip. Hold. His pressure. I know what his pressure is. Hold. Her hands were covered in blood to the wrists. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the cold concrete under her knees. Present. Noted. Irrelevant. She'd been bloodied up to the elbows in worse situations than this. She'd packed wounds under fire with the sound of incoming rounds changing the acoustic quality of the air around her. This was a cold warehouse with good lights and 4 operators who would do exactly what she told them. This was manageable. 11 minutes after she'd knelt down, she looked at Marcus's face and saw something different there. More color. The breathing still fast but deeper. His eyes tracking with intention rather than the swimming, disconnected drift of terminal shock. "His pressure?" she said. Someone read it. 94/62. She sat back on her heels for 1 second. Just one. "He's not out of this," she said. "He needs a vascular surgeon and he needs blood. But he's stable enough to move." She looked at Reeves. "You need to get him to a trauma center in the next hour. Whoever you have clearance with, call them. Now." Reeves was already on a radio. It was only then, with her hands still and the immediate emergency compressed into a different shape, that Claire became aware of the specific quality of the silence in the warehouse, the way the 4 operators had arranged themselves, the way Reeves was not looking at her, which was different from the focused, practical non-looking of the past 11 minutes, and was instead the deliberate non-looking of someone who was managing information. She looked around the warehouse properly for the first time. There were crates stacked against the far wall, not random storage, organized, labeled, with the kind of systematic arrangement that suggested not one person's individual stacking preference, but a system, a process, multiple hands over time. Medical supply crates. She couldn't read the labels from this distance, but she recognized the shapes, the dimensions, the particular way medical supply boxes were engineered for stackability and weight distribution. She'd ordered hundreds of them. She'd inventoried shortages of them for 8 months at Ash Hollow, documenting discrepancies that her supervisors kept telling her were data entry errors, system glitches, paperwork from a prior quarter not yet reconciled. Her eyes stayed on the crates for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. She stood up. "Someone should stay with Marcus. He needs continuous monitoring. Check his pressure every 3 minutes. Watch his breathing rate. If he drops below 80 systolic, you radio whoever you're calling right now." Donovan. Reeves's voice had a different texture than it had outside the hospital, something that might have been respect, or something adjacent to it. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when he's in an OR." From somewhere above them, outside maybe 200 feet, she heard it, The distinctive thrum of helicopter rotors. Heavy, measured, military grade, not emergency services. That rhythm was too deliberate, too controlled. She watched Reeves move toward the far end of the warehouse where a pair of bay doors stood partially open. He spoke quietly into his radio. She caught fragments, confirmed, on site, package, secure. And then something that pulled all the warmth out of the air around her. The nurse is cooperative. She doesn't know yet. Claire looked down at her blood-covered hands. She looked back at the crates. She looked at the bay doors where the helicopter sound was getting louder, closer, descending. Doesn't know yet. She had an 8-year nursing career, 6 months of documented supply discrepancies, an inexplicable termination, and 4 armed men who'd abducted her from a parking lot telling someone on a radio that she didn't know yet. Somewhere between the femoral artery and the crates and the helicopter cutting through the October fog, the story she'd been telling herself about her own life, the one where she'd simply burned out, where the hospital had simply found reasons to push her out, where she'd simply had bad luck with supervisors and timing and circumstances. That story began to fall apart. Because if she didn't know something, then there was something to know. And whatever it was had been worth abducting a nurse from a parking lot at midnight to keep contained. Marcus made a sound, pain, awareness returning, and she turned back to him because that was what she did. She managed the emergency that was directly in front of her, but her mind was already somewhere else, moving fast through 8 months of anomalies and dismissals and crates in a warehouse, reassembling the architecture of something she hadn't understood she'd been standing inside all along. The helicopter settled onto the ground outside with a sound like controlled thunder. The bay doors opened wide, and the pale-eyed man named Reeves walked back toward her, and in his face was something she hadn't seen there before. Not command, not authority, but something closer to reckoning, like a man who knew the conversation he was about to have was going to change things and had run out of time to find a better way to begin it. Reeves didn't apologize. She'd expected that, somehow. Some version of, "I'm sorry for how we brought you in here," the kind of preemptive softening that men in authority used when they wanted compliance without confrontation. He didn't offer it. He just walked back across the warehouse floor with the helicopter rotors still turning outside, and he looked at her the way you looked at someone you'd underestimated and were still recalibrating around. "There are things you need to understand," he said. "Start with who you are," Claire said. "That's not the most important thing right now." "It is to me." He considered that for a moment. Not hostile, just measuring. Special Investigations Unit attached to the Defense Logistics Agency. We don't have a public profile. And Marcus? One of ours. 3 others went in with him tonight. 2 made it out clean. 1 didn't make it out at all. He said it flat, the way people said things they'd already processed because they couldn't afford to process them in the field. Marcus was the only one in range of extraction. Claire absorbed that. Someone had died tonight. Someone she hadn't been able to help because she hadn't been there yet. She didn't say that. It wouldn't help anything. "The crates," she said instead. Reeves's jaw shifted slightly. "What about them?" "How long have they been here?" He looked at her for a beat too long. "How would you know what those are?" "Because I spent 8 months filing discrepancy reports about missing medical supply inventory at Ash Hollow," Claire said. "And I know what a Medline logistics box looks like from 20 feet in bad light. I've opened enough of them." She kept her voice level. "So how long?" He exhaled through his nose. 18 months, minimum. Possibly longer. We're still building the full chain." 18 months. She'd been at Ash Hollow for 8, which meant this had been going before she ever walked through those doors, had been running underneath everything the entire time she was there, and she had stumbled into the edges of it without understanding what she was stumbling into. "Who's running it?" she said. "That's the conversation we need to have," Reeves said. "But not here. Can you walk?" She looked at her hands, still dark with Marcus's blood. "Do I have a choice?" "You always have a choice," he said. "We're not the ones who took yours away." That landed differently than he probably intended. She followed him toward the far end of the warehouse, toward a door she hadn't noticed before. Unmarked, recessed into the wall, the kind of door that was designed to not be the one you went through unless you already knew it was there. There was a room behind it, Not large, maybe 15 by 20, with a folding table, 4 chairs, and a laptop running on what appeared to be a satellite connection. A woman was seated at the table, late 30s, close-cropped natural hair, wearing the same deliberately nondescript civilian clothes as the rest of them. She looked up when Claire entered and didn't smile, but there was something in her expression that wasn't the flat operational blankness of the others, something that looked faintly like recognition. "This is Agent Yara Sims," Reeves said. Sims nodded. "Sit down, Ms. Donovan." "I'd rather stand." "That's fine." Sims pulled the laptop around so the screen faced the center of the table. "What I'm about to show you is classified. Not technically. We're outside the formal chain of custody tonight for reasons that will become obvious, but the operational sensitivity is equivalent. You understand what that means?" "It means you'd rather I didn't discuss it at a dinner party." Sims looked at Reeves. Reeves looked at the ceiling. "More or less," Sims said, and pulled up the first document. It was a logistics manifest. Claire recognized the header format. She'd processed hundreds of similar documents in her first year at Ash Hollow, back when she still believed that the administrative side of hospital work could be organized if you just applied enough systematic attention to it. Standard inventory, surgical supplies, IV consumables, hemostatic agents, trauma packing materials. Items that were unremarkable individually and collectively represented hundreds of thousands of dollars per shipment, but the destination codes were wrong. She leaned forward without meaning to. "These facility codes," she said, "these aren't hospital identifiers." "No," Sims said. "They're not." "What are they?" "Shell companies. LLCs incorporated in Delaware and Montana, all registered within a 14-month window 3 years ago. On paper, they look like regional medical distribution hubs. In practice, they're receivables. They accept the shipment gets reclassified on paper, and the physical inventory moves again. At that point, it disappears into private channels. Private channels meaning what, exactly? "Meaning sold," Reeves said from behind her. "Off-book to buyers who don't ask where it came from." Claire straightened. "Military medical inventory?" "Some of it, yes. Some of it civilian hospital supply diverted before it ever reaches the ward level. The operation spans both systems." Sims swiped to the next document. "The civilian hospital component is where Ash Hollow comes in." The next document was a contract. Claire's eyes moved to the signatory line at the bottom and then to the entity name at the top, and something in her chest did something complicated and unpleasant. Ash Hollow Medical Center, a procurement agreement with one of the shell companies. Dated 14 months ago, 4 months before Claire had been hired. "They were already running this when I started," she said. "Yes. And the supply discrepancies I was reporting were real," Sims said. "Every one of them. You were documenting inventory that had already been diverted at the source. Your reports were being intercepted at the supervisor level and buried." Karen Stoltz. The name arrived in Claire's mind without drama, just the flat click of a piece fitting into a shape she'd been staring at for 8 months. "My supervisor," Claire said. Sims didn't answer that directly, which was its own answer. "We need you to understand the scope of what you were walking around inside," Reeves said. "Because you didn't get fired because you were a bad nurse. You got fired because you were a very good one who kept noticing things that people were being paid a significant amount of money to make sure nobody noticed." Claire stood with that for a moment. The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the helicopter rotor slowing, winding down to idle. She had known something was wrong. She'd known it the way you knew things that you couldn't fully articulate, the accumulation of small evidence that your rational mind kept trying to explain away because the alternative explanation was too large to sit with comfortably. But knowing something wrong is happening and understanding the specific shape of it are different experiences, and the specific shape of this one was bigger than she'd built it in her head. "Who's at the top of it?" she said. Sims pulled up a photograph. The man in it was late 50s. Silver-haired, military-bearing, chest full of ribbons, the kind of face that appeared in congressional testimony and Pentagon press briefings, and the backgrounds of official photographs going back 2 decades. The kind of face that had been institutional for so long, it stopped looking like a person and started looking like a symbol. "General Victor Hale," Sims said. "Defense Logistics Command. 26 years of service. The man controls medical supply procurement for 3 theater commands and has oversight authority over civilian hospital partnerships established under the Defense Community Health Integration Act. Which means he decides what goes where, Claire said. Which means he decides what goes where, Sims confirmed. And for the past 3 years, a significant portion of what was supposed to go to forward deployed medical teams has been going sideways. We estimate the total diverted inventory value at somewhere between $40 and $60 million. The number was large enough to feel abstract. Claire's mind kept trying to translate it into human terms. How many units of hemostatic gauze? How many units of blood product? How many trauma kits that weren't where they were supposed to be when someone needed them? How many people had bled out in places where the shelves were lighter than they should have been? She felt something move in her that wasn't fear and wasn't quite anger, something older and quieter than both. "What do you need from me?" she said. Dirte. What they needed was complicated. Sims walked her through it over the next 40 minutes, and Claire sat down eventually because standing started to feel performative. The situation was this. Marcus's team had been running a covert evidence-gathering operation targeting the physical inventory storage points, the warehouses, like this one, where diverted supplies were held between transfers. Tonight's operation had been compromised. One operator was dead. Marcus was alive because of Claire, but his condition meant their primary evidence chain was broken. He'd been carrying physical documentation recovered from the previous warehouse location before the situation went loud. That documentation was now partially destroyed. What they had left was a fragmented record that pointed clearly at Hale, but didn't close the loop on the civilian hospital side of the operation. Without that, a defense attorney with Hale's resources and connections would have enough daylight to work with. The civilian connection runs through Ash Hollow's procurement records, Sims said, specifically through a series of purchase orders generated over an 18-month window that were signed off at the administrative director level. "Whitmore," Claire said. Sims looked at her. "Drew Whitmore, administrative director. He signs everything. Or rather, his signature appears on everything. Half the time it's his assistant pre-signing on authority delegation, which is its own problem, but the actual authorization decisions flow through his office." Claire had dealt with Whitmore twice in 8 months. Both times he'd been the particular kind of affable that felt like a locked door with a welcome mat in front of it. "He's careful. He stays at a distance from anything that could be directly tied back to him." "We know," Sims said. "That's why we need the discrepancy documentation." "Mine." "Yours. Your reports from the past 8 months, the ones that were filed and buried, create a contemporaneous record of inventory anomalies that map directly onto the diversion timeline. If we can recover the original filed versions with timestamps and routing metadata, we can show that the hospital administration received documented evidence of irregular inventory activity and chose to suppress it. That's not just negligence, that's conspiracy. Claire was quiet for a moment. Those reports were filed through the hospital's internal system. Yes. Which I no longer have access to, as of about 2 hours ago. We know that too. Sims folded her hands on the table. We have someone who can get into the system from outside, but we need you to walk them through which reports to look for, how they were categorized, what the filing pathway was. The technical access isn't the problem. The institutional knowledge is. Claire thought about the 8 months of reports. The specific language she'd used because she'd learned early that vague complaints went nowhere. She'd been precise, had cited specific item numbers, specific dates, specific receiving signatures. She'd built those reports like legal documents because she'd wanted them to be taken seriously. She'd had no idea how seriously. "Okay," she said. "Tell me what you need." Reeves, who'd been standing by the door the whole time, said, "There's something else." Something in his tone made Sims look at him, made Claire look at him. "Marcus had a secondary item on him when he came in tonight," he said. "We recovered it before the extraction." He reached into his jacket and set a small waterproof evidence bag on the table. Inside was what appeared to be a standard-issue USB drive, military spec, the kind with a ruggedized housing. He pulled this from the previous site. "We haven't been able to confirm the contents because we don't have the decryption key." "And you think the key is in my reports," Claire said. "We think the key is in something you wrote," Reeves said. "Specifically in a notation you made on a specific report filed 7 months ago that referenced a procurement code you flagged as unrecognized. We think that code is a fragment of the encryption key, and we think Hale's people didn't catch it because you buried it in administrative language that looked like standard error flagging. Claire stared at him. I didn't do that on purpose, she said. We know, Reeves said, which makes it better evidence, not worse. You stumbled onto a fragment of their internal coding system without knowing what it was. The room felt different than it had 10 minutes ago. The weight of things had redistributed. Claire was no longer a nurse who'd been brought in to handle a medical emergency and was now being debriefed. She was something else, a person who had been walking around for 8 months with a piece of something dangerous and hadn't known it, and whose not knowing was, apparently, one of the reasons she was still in a position to be sitting in this room. If Hale's people had realized what I'd documented, she started. They would have moved faster, Sims said. Yes. Claire looked at the USB drive in its evidence bag. What's on it? She said. If you could decrypt it, what are we looking at? Reeves and Sims exchanged a look that was brief and loaded. Operational records, Reeves said. Names, accounts, transaction records for the full 3 years. Every payment, every shipment, every person who took money to look the other way. If the drive is intact and the contents are what Marcus believed them to be, it's the entire operation, every name, every transaction, all of it. It buries him, Claire said. It buries all of them. She looked at the drive for another few seconds. Then she looked up. So what do we do first? They worked through the rest of the night. Someone brought her a towel and a bottle of water, and she cleaned her hands as well as she could, which wasn't very well. And she drank the water in 3 long pulls, and then she sat down in front of the laptop and started talking. The analyst on the other end of the secure connection, a voice only, no face, identified as Tanner, walked her through the hospital's internal filing system remotely while she described the architecture from memory. She'd navigated those menus more times than she could count. She knew the quirks of it, the counterintuitive categorization system that someone had clearly built without consulting anyone who actually had to use it, the specific subfolder pathway where supply discrepancy reports went after initial filing. It's under quality assurance, not supply chain, she told Tanner, which doesn't make sense, but that's where they put it. Then subfolder 3, which is labeled variance documentation, and then there's a secondary sort by department, and you're looking for the ER flags. I'm in the quality assurance directory, Tanner said. I'm seeing variance documentation. Going in now. A pause. Okay. I'm seeing flagged reports. There are... Another pause, longer. 47 reports in the subfolder attributed to your employee ID. 47, Claire said. I filed 53. The silence that followed lasted long enough to have a shape. 6 reports are missing from the record, Tanner said. Which ones? I'm looking at the date gaps. The missing reports would fall in March, April, and 2 in June, and then 2 in August. March and April were when she'd first started flagging the surgical supply shortages in a systematic way, when she'd shifted from informal verbal complaints to formal written documentation. June was when she'd found the procurement code discrepancy that apparently contained a fragment of something much larger. August was when the termination process had begun, formally attributed to performance concerns, specifically a complaint filed by a patient's family about a communication issue that Claire had disputed and that had never been formally investigated. They pulled 6 reports, she said, the ones that would have built the clearest picture. They pulled 6, Tanner confirmed, but here's the thing. And his voice shifted slightly, took on the particular texture of someone who'd just found what they were looking for. Deleted files aren't gone. They're just not indexed. I'm running a recovery search on the metadata. Another pause. Yeah, they're here. All 6. Someone deleted them from the Active Directory but didn't wipe the underlying data. Either they were in a hurry or they didn't understand how the system worked at the infrastructure level. Can you recover them? Sims asked, leaning toward the laptop. Already doing it. Give me 8 minutes. It was closer to 12, but Tanner delivered all 6 reports, intact, with their original timestamps and routing metadata showing exactly where they'd been filed, who had received them in the system's automated notification chain, and, Critically, a read confirmation timestamp showing that 2 of the reports had been opened and reviewed at the administrative director level within 48 hours of filing. Whitmore had read them. Not his assistant, not a delegate, his personal credentials, his session ID, his timestamp. He had read the reports that documented irregular inventory matching the diversion timeline. He had read them, and then he had deleted them, and then he had begun the process of building a performance case against the nurse who'd written them. Claire looked at that timestamp for a long time. It wasn't satisfaction, what she felt. It was something more complicated, a kind of grief maybe, for the version of events she'd spent months constructing where she was simply in the wrong place, simply unlucky, simply not good enough for an institution that had made its decision about her. That story had been easier to carry than this one. This one meant she'd been right all along. This one meant the past 8 months had been something done to her deliberately, by people who'd decided that a nurse filing accurate reports was a more manageable problem than the thing she was accurately reporting. She'd been right, and being right had cost her everything she'd built. "Send the recovered files to the secure server," Reeves said. "All 6 plus the intact 47. "Already uploading," Tanner said. Reeves looked at Claire. "Are you all right?" "No," she said, "but that's not the point right now." The decryption of the drive took longer. The notation she'd made in the June report, a procurement code she'd flagged as unrecognized and escalated with the specific number string because she'd wanted the error to be traceable, matched a 16-character fragment in the middle of the drive's encryption key. It didn't give them the whole key, but it gave Tanner's technical team enough scaffolding to run a targeted reconstruction. At 4:23 a.m., the drive opened. What came out of it was not organized the way evidence usually was when people deliberately created records of wrongdoing, because people rarely created records of their own wrongdoing deliberately. What it was instead was operational data, the actual transaction records, supply chain logs, financial transfers, personnel communications, the living infrastructure of the operation, kept because the operation required it to function, not because anyone intended it to be found. 3 years of it. Sims worked through it with Tanner while Claire sat against the wall with her second bottle of water and watched the light shift. There was a single high window in the room, small and dirty, and the blackness in it went the particular dense blue of very early morning and then began, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. 14 officers, Sims said at some point. 14 names attached to operational roles. "Hale's at the top," Reeves said. Hale signed 3 of the primary diversion orders directly. The rest were run through cutouts, but the document trail goes back to him. His personal cipher is on the authentication chain. She sat back. "This is everything. This is the whole picture. Do we have enough for the justice side?" "We have enough to start fires in 4 different agencies simultaneously." Reeves put his phone to his ear, stepped out of the room. Claire listened to the quiet that followed. Tanner was still processing. Sims was making notes. The helicopter outside had been silent for hours. It had departed with Marcus and one of the other operators somewhere around 2 a.m., destination undisclosed, and Garrett had gone with them, and the warehouse was smaller without those people in it. She was tired in a way that went past physical. The adrenaline that had carried her through Marcus's surgery and the briefing and the file recovery had metabolized into something flat and dull, and she was very aware of the fact that she was sitting on the floor of an abandoned warehouse in a jacket that wasn't hers because her original jacket was in her car, which was still in the hospital parking lot. She should probably find out what was happening to her car. That thought, absurd and mundane in the middle of everything else, almost made her laugh. Reeves came back. His face was different. The operational composure was still there, but underneath it something had shifted, the way a dial shifts when a number lands. "What?" Sims said. "Hale knows the operation was compromised tonight." Reeves's voice was controlled, but barely. "He's moving. He's initiated a document destruction protocol at his office, and he's requested emergency travel authorization." He looked at Claire. "And he's made contact with Ash Hollow administration, Whitmore specifically." Claire was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. "He's telling them to clean house," she said. "We don't know exactly. He's telling them to get rid of anything that can be tied to the civilian side. The paper records, the physical inventory logs, whatever hasn't been digitized." She was already moving toward the door. "How much time do we have?" The contact was made 20 minutes ago, Reeves said. Whitmore's building access was logged at 4:08 a.m. She stopped. He's already there. Yes. And your team, we're not positioned for a civilian facility breach. We don't have jurisdiction inside the hospital without a federal warrant, and the warrant process takes— How long? She said. He held her gaze. Hours we don't have. The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Sims said slowly, There is one way into that building right now that doesn't require a warrant. Claire looked at her. Your access card was deactivated at midnight, Sims said, but your employee badge, the physical badge, was still on the premises when your supervisor processed your termination. Under the hospital's own security protocol, a deactivated employee's physical badge is held for 72 hours in the security office before destruction, in case of administrative appeal. I know the protocol, Claire said. If someone were to present that badge to the overnight security officer, Sims said carefully, and request access on grounds of retrieving personal property left during a termination, standard, documented, legitimate reason, the overnight officer would most likely contact HR. But HR doesn't respond to after-hours calls for 60 to 90 minutes. Which gives whoever goes in a window, Claire said. A window, Sims confirmed. The implication was clear enough that nobody needed to state it directly. Claire thought about 8 months of careful, accurate, meticulously documented work that had been used as evidence against her rather than for her. She thought about Marcus on the warehouse floor. She thought about the operator who hadn't made it out at all, whose name she still didn't know, whose absence was somewhere in this room like a specific shape of cold. She thought about the procurement code in her June report that she'd flagged because flagging anomalies was what a good nurse did, and how that one small act of professional diligence had accidentally trapped a fragment of something massive. "Where's my badge?" she said. Reeves reached into his jacket and set it on the table. She stared at it for a moment. Her name, her photo, the Ash Hollow logo, the lanyard hole at the top where she'd stripped it off her lanyard 3 hours ago and set it on the break room counter and walked away. She picked it up. "I need someone on comms," she said, "and I need to know exactly which office Whitmore is using and what the physical layout of the administrative wing looks like at 4 in the morning. "I can give you all of that," Tanner said, still on the connection. "One more thing," Reeves said. He was looking at her with that calibrated look again, the one that was still working through its recalculation. "You understand that if you go in there tonight and Whitmore or building security makes contact with anyone tied to Hale's network before we have the warrant in place?" "I know," Claire said. "I've made difficult calls before." He nodded. Something in it that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite respect, and was probably both. She was almost at the door when Sims's voice stopped her. "Donovan." She turned. "The report you filed in June," Sims said. "The one with the procurement code. You escalated it through every channel available to you, even after the first 2 went nowhere." "Yes." "Why? You could have stopped. Most people would have stopped." Claire thought about it. The honest answer wasn't heroic. The honest answer was that she'd been too tired and too stubborn to let it go. That it had become a matter of principle in the way that things became when you had very little left to hold on to, and principle was cheaper to maintain than peace. "Because something was wrong," she said, "and I knew how to document it." She walked out. The fog was still heavy outside, but the blackness had gone fully blue now, the particular pre-dawn blue that preceded actual light by 30 minutes. She could hear the bay somewhere beyond the warehouse walls. The low rhythmic sound of water against structure, patient and indifferent. She had 30 minutes before the sky changed. She had a badge that would open a door. And somewhere inside Ash Hollow Medical Center, a man was destroying evidence that she had spent 8 months accidentally protecting. The SUV started. Reeves was driving. Neither of them spoke. The city moved past the windows in its sleeping shape, streetlights and empty intersections and the occasional lit window of someone else awake at this hour for reasons that were probably nothing like hers. She held her badge in her hand and looked at her own photograph and thought about Pete, the longshoreman, and what he'd said about people who looked through you. She was done being looked through. The hospital came into view, its upper floors lit against the still dark sky, the ER entrance glowing amber at the base. Reeves pulled to the side street adjacent to the staff entrance and put the SUV in park. "Tanner's feeding your earpiece," he said. She put the small device in her ear. "You've got one way in and one way out," Tanner said in her ear, calm and immediate. "Whitmore is in the administrative wing on the second floor. He's been stationary in his office for 11 minutes. Security officer overnight is a guy named Patterson. He's covered this shift for 3 years. He knows your face." "Okay," she said. "One more thing." Tanner's voice shifted. "There are 2 other people in that building right now that aren't on the overnight roster." Claire's hand froze on the door handle. "Who?" "I don't know yet," Tanner said. "But they badged in 4 minutes after Whitmore, using credentials that are flagged as inactive in the system." She looked at Reeves. "Someone helped him get in," Reeves said quietly. "Someone who's not supposed to be there." Her hand was still on the door. Inside that building, something was happening faster than any of them had calculated, and she was about to walk into the middle of it with a deactivated badge and an earpiece and the particular kind of steadiness that only held as long as you didn't think too carefully about the odds. The staff entrance door was 30 feet away. She got out of the car. The staff entrance door had a keypad and a card reader, and Claire had used both approximately 4,000 times over 8 years, which meant her hands moved to them before her brain fully caught up. The physical badge touched the reader. The reader beeped. The light stayed red. She'd expected that. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the specific feeling of standing in front of a door that used to open for her and watching it refuse in the pre-dawn gray, with an earpiece feeding her information about people inside who weren't supposed to be there. There was something clarifying about it. All the abstract weight of the past 8 months compressed into one small red light. She pressed the intercom button instead. The overnight security station picked up in 12 seconds. Ash Hollow Medical Security Desk. "Patterson, it's Claire Donovan. I was on staff until tonight. Until last night, I guess. I left some personal items in my locker when I processed out, and I need to retrieve them." A pause. Not suspicious, just tired. Patterson was a 61-year-old retired city cop who'd worked the overnight security desk for 4 years and had always been decent to her, the way people who'd seen genuinely bad situations tended to be decent to nurses who'd also seen genuinely bad situations. "Ms. Donovan." His voice had the particular texture of a man who was now going to have to do something that required getting out of his chair. "You know I need to call this in." "I know. HR won't pick up for another hour at least, but I just need my stuff, Patterson. It'll take 10 minutes. Another pause. "Come around to the main lobby. I'll buzz you through there." She walked around. Reeves's voice came through the earpiece, low and even. "Tanner's tracking the 2 unknown badges. They're in the stairwell between first and second floor. Moving." "Toward Whitmore?" "Can't tell yet." The main lobby doors unlocked with a heavy click. Patterson was standing at the security desk with his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the expression of a man recalculating his evening. "I appreciate it," Claire said, and she meant it, which made the next part harder. "You know I still have to log this," he said. "Unauthorized after-hours access, even with a former employee." "I know." She stopped at the desk. "Patterson, is there anyone else in the building tonight? Anyone who came in after midnight?" He looked at her. "Administrative access is logged separate from security. That's not something I can—" "I'm not asking you to tell me who. I'm asking if you saw anyone come through." The pause this time was different. His eyes moved briefly toward the stairwell door. "Mr. Whitmore came in around 4. That's not unusual when there's a board situation." "Anyone else?" Patterson's jaw set in a way that said he was choosing his words. 2 others badged in through the east entrance. I didn't recognize them, which isn't normal." She held his gaze. "Patterson, if something's happening in this building tonight that shouldn't be, if someone's doing something they need to not be caught doing, you need to not be between them and the exit when this resolves." He was smart enough to hear what she was actually saying. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you to call Grayport PD right now, not hospital administration. The police." She kept her voice level. "Tell them you have unauthorized individuals in the building outside of security clearance. That's enough." He looked at her for a long 3 seconds. Then he reached for his phone. She went for the stairs. The second-floor administrative wing at 4:45 a.m. was lit by the overnight setting, every third overhead light, giving the corridor a particular institutional dimness that made the floor tiles look gray instead of white, and turned the row of framed hospital mission statements on the wall into dark rectangles with suggestion of text. Claire knew this corridor. She'd been up here 8 times in 8 months, each time to deliver or follow up on a report that went nowhere. Tanner in her ear. Whitmore is still in his office. East end of the corridor, third door from the stairwell exit. The two unknowns are... Wait. A pause that had a shape to it. They just stopped moving. They're on your floor. I don't have camera coverage on the east wing, only lobby and stairwells. Claire kept walking. Her footsteps were deliberate, quiet, but not stealthy, because stealth in a building where she'd worked for years would look wrong if anyone saw her, and looking wrong right now was a liability she couldn't afford. She passed the first door, the second. She could see light under the third. Whitmore's office, a thin, bright line at the base of the door. She could also see about 40 feet further down the corridor, in the recessed alcove where the east wing met the administrative suite entrance, 2 shapes that weren't furniture. They were standing very still. Claire stopped. The shapes didn't move, but one of them turned its head just slightly, and the dim corridor light caught a face for a half second. Male, mid-40s, the kind of physical stillness that was trained rather than natural. These were not hospital staff, and they were between her and the exit at the east end. She turned calmly, unhurriedly, and knocked on Whitmore's office door. "Mr. Whitmore." "It's Claire Donovan." The silence that followed lasted long enough to be a decision. Then, "Come in, Ball." Drew Whitmore was a man who looked better in photographs than in person, which was a fact Claire had observed both times she'd met him previously, and which was even more true at 4:45 a.m. with his jacket off and his shirt slightly untucked, and his face carrying the particular high color of someone whose blood pressure was doing something he didn't want it to be doing. His desk was covered in papers. Not organized, disrupted, the way papers looked when someone had been moving through them quickly, pulling some, stacking others. A deliberate disorder that was still visibly in process. He was destroying things, or trying to decide what to destroy. He looked at her, and for a moment his face did something that he managed to suppress before it became fully readable. But she'd caught the edge of it. Surprise, and under the surprise, something sharper. "Miss Donovan." His voice was practiced, calm. "This is irregular." "I left some things in my locker," she said. "I came back for them. At 5 a.m. I couldn't sleep." He studied her. She'd always been able to tell when people were deciding how much they thought she knew, because there was a specific quality to that calculation, a kind of stillness behind the eyes while the social machinery of the face kept operating. "Your locker would be in the staff area," he said, "not the administrative wing. I know, I was going to stop by your office first." She looked at his desk, made it obvious she was looking. "Since we didn't get a chance to talk yesterday, when HR processed me out." "There's nothing to talk about, Ms. Donovan. The termination was documented," she said. "Everything was very documented." "That's true." She held his gaze. "I'm curious about something, though. Some of my reports, the inventory variance reports I filed through the QA system, I went back to look at them tonight and noticed some gaps in the record. 6 reports that should be there aren't." The blood pressure color in his face moved, shifted. "System data retention has gaps sometimes," he said. "That's an IT question." "You read 2 of them personally," she said. "I have the session log showing your credentials and timestamp." The room went very still. Tanner's voice in her ear, barely a whisper. "The 2 individuals are moving. They're coming toward Whitmore's office." Claire kept her eyes on Whitmore. "Did you read my reports, Mr. Whitmore?" He stood up from behind his desk. Not aggressive, calculated. The move of a man repositioning himself, creating options. "Ms. Donovan, I'm going to need you to leave this building. Whatever you think you're doing here, I'm asking you a question. Security can escort you." "I called the police on my way up," she said. "Patterson's already on with them." It was half true. Patterson was calling. She didn't know if he'd actually gotten through, didn't know if Reeves outside had done anything to accelerate that process. Didn't know much of anything except that she was in a room with a man who was dismantling evidence and two strangers in the corridor who were now 30 seconds away. Whitmore's face changed. It shed something. The professional warmth, the administrative distance, the performance of a man who handled difficult employees with regret and patience. What was underneath it wasn't rage. It was calculation, stripped down to its operational core. "You've made a very serious mistake," he said. "Multiple, probably," Claire said, "but not about this." The door opened. But the two men who walked in were not hospital security. She'd known that from the corridor, confirmed it now. Their build, their hands, the way they filled the doorway without announcing themselves. One was the face she'd half seen in the alcove. The other was younger, with a haircut that said military and eyes that said currently employed by something that wasn't the military anymore. The younger one looked at Whitmore. "We need to move. The window is closing." Whitmore looked at Claire. She called the police. A beat. The older man's eyes went to her. She was calculating the distance to the door, which these two were now blocking. She was calculating the desk between her and Whitmore, the papers on it, the phone. Office landlines were still wired to the hospital switchboard, which meant any call from this room went through the front desk first. She was calculating what she actually had, which was an earpiece connected to someone who could hear everything happening in this room if she kept talking. "Tanner," she said, normally, as if she were addressing someone in the room, "did you get all of that?" The older man moved. He came around the desk fast, not at her but past her, toward the office landline, and he pulled the phone cord from the wall with one clean pull. Then he stopped and looked at her ear. "Who are you talking to?" he said. "People who are listening," she said. He was good. His face didn't change, but his right hand moved to his jacket and didn't come back out empty-handed, and what it came back with was compact and matte, and answered a question she'd been keeping in the back of her mind since she'd walked into the building. She put her hands up. Not because she was afraid, fear was there, but it was organized, filed away in the part of her that knew it had to wait, but because there was nothing tactically useful in pretending she had options she didn't have. "Reeves," she said. "Second floor, administrative east. Now would be good." No response in her ear. She didn't know if that was signal loss or if Reeves had been monitoring the whole time. She didn't know if Patterson had reached anyone. She didn't know if Tanner was still in the hospital's system or if someone had killed the connection. What she knew was that she was standing in front of Drew Whitmore's desk with a gun pointed at her by a man who'd come here for the same reason she had, the papers on that desk, and who had considerably less reason to let her leave than she had to want to. Whitmore was moving around the desk, gathering papers into a folder with the focused speed of someone who'd made a decision and was now on a clock. "Get her out of the building," he said to the older man. "Separately, clean." "That means different things to different people," Claire said. "It means we drive you somewhere quiet, and we all have a conversation about what you think you know and what you'd like your future to look like," the older man said. His voice was reasonable. That was the frightening part, the absolute reasonableness of it. "We're not looking for complications." "Then you came to the wrong building," she said. Tanner's voice crackled back into her ear, faint, broken, like he was fighting interference. "Federal units are, Reeves is, lobby in, 2 minutes." 2 minutes was both very short and very long, depending on what happened in it. The younger man was at the window now, looking down. She heard something from outside, or felt it rather than heard it, a low vibration that could have been a vehicle on the street below, or could have been something else entirely. "Someone's outside," the younger man said. The older man's attention shifted. A fraction of a second, the way a scope shifted between targets, and Claire moved, not toward the door, toward the desk. She put both hands flat on the stack of papers Whitmore was gathering and pushed. Not a dramatic sweep, she just pushed, and the papers went in 4 directions and the folder went with them, and Whitmore grabbed at them and missed half. And in the 3 seconds of that scramble, she got her phone out of her jacket pocket and took a photograph of the desk surface. Then another. The paper that landed face up in front of her was a financial transfer record. She couldn't read all of it, but she caught the name of one of the shell companies Sims had shown her, caught a dollar figure with 6 zeros, caught a date stamp from 11 days ago. She took a third photograph. The older man had his hand on her arm. Not rough? Professional. The kind of grip designed to move a person without bruising that a defense attorney later had to explain. Give me the phone, he said. Tell me your name first, she said. If we're going to have a conversation somewhere quiet, I'd like to know who I'm talking to. Markov, he said, and then looked briefly annoyed with himself for answering. Markov, she repeated clearly for the earpiece. And Whitmore. And a financial transfer document dated 11 days ago connected to... He took the phone, cleanly, efficiently, from her hand and put it in his jacket. We're leaving, he said. She let him walk her toward the door because the door was where she wanted to go. Her hands were at her sides, heart rate elevated but not out of control. Her body remembered this, remembered the specific physical grammar of situations where the correct move was compliance and patience and waiting for the geometry to shift. The corridor outside Whitmore's office was darker than when she'd walked through it, or maybe it just felt that way. Markov was behind her, close but not touching. The younger man was ahead. Whitmore, still gathering papers behind them, was the only one not moving toward the exit. They reached the stairwell door. Markov pushed it open and stopped. Because coming up the stairs, not rushing, just moving with the particular ground-level certainty of people who had the legal authority to go anywhere in the building they chose, were two individuals in federal windbreakers with identification already out. Behind them, a Grayport PD officer, and behind him, Reeves. Reeves looked at Claire, then at Markov, then at the gun, which Markov had not reholstered. Put it down, Reeves said, in the voice of someone who'd made this statement before and understood its grammar completely. The stairwell was very quiet for a moment. Then Markov made the calculation that people with experience made when the geometry had definitively shifted and put the weapon on the stair railing slowly, grip first. Claire exhaled. It was not a dramatic breath, just the body releasing something it had been holding. Whitmore's in his office, she said. He has documents on his desk. Some of them are on the floor. Don't let anyone touch them before you photograph the positions. And there are financial transfer records. I got 3 photographs before Markov took my phone. She looked at Markov's jacket pocket. One of the federal agents stepped forward. Ms. Donovan, Reeves said. He was looking at her in a way she was starting to recognize. That recalibration that happened in stages each time she did something his operational planning hadn't fully accounted for. My phone, she said. He nodded at the agent. The phone came back to her. She checked the photographs. All 3 intact. The phone had uploaded automatically to the cloud backup the moment she'd taken them, which meant even if Markov had wiped the device, the images were already off it. She'd set up the auto-upload feature 18 months ago because she kept losing photos when her phone died. The most mundane possible decision, creating the most useful possible backup. She went back to the stairwell railing and sat down on the step. Her legs were not shaking, but they wanted to, and she didn't see any reason to argue with them. The next 2 hours happened around her in the organized chaos that federal law enforcement generated when descending on a location. Radios and documentation protocols, and the specific loud, quiet rhythm of multiple agencies trying to coordinate in a space not designed for it. Whitmore was walked out of his office 20 minutes after the stairwell confrontation, without his folder, with 2 federal agents flanking him and the particular shell-shocked expression of a man whose planning had been constructed entirely around a version of this morning that no longer existed. He looked at Claire as they passed her in the corridor. She looked back. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything that needed saying. Markov and the younger man, whose name she eventually learned was Dufresne, though how he'd arrived at employment with people like Whitmore was a story nobody fully told her, were processed in the lobby. Markov was cooperative in the flat, careful way of someone who was already calculating what he was and wasn't willing to trade. Dufresne was less composed, and his composure deteriorating was apparently informative to people whose job was to read that kind of deterioration. Reeves spent an hour on the phone and then found her in a small conference room off the lobby where someone had brought her coffee that she hadn't asked for but was drinking anyway because it was something warm to hold. Tanner recovered everything before the connection dropped, he said. All the financial documents on Whitmore's desk were photographed in situ by the forensic team. The 3 photographs on your phone are being added to the evidence chain. And the drive? The drive is now officially in federal custody. The decryption was confirmed complete at 4:12 a.m. He sat down across from her. Hale's name is attached to 104 individual transactions over a 38-month period. That's before we've finished the full analysis. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. Marcus? In surgery at a military medical facility as of 2 hours ago. The vascular team said the stabilization work you did was... He paused, choosing words. They said it was the reason he had a viable repair option. She nodded. She didn't need the credit, but she was glad he was alive. And Hale? She said. He filed travel authorization to Fort Devens at 4 a.m. He's still on base. There are federal investigators en route with an arrest warrant. Reeves's voice was even. He doesn't know yet that the warehouse operation was compromised. He thinks tonight's raid failed. He thinks he has time, she said. He has about 40 minutes. The coffee was bad. Institutional coffee was always bad at this hour, something about the overnight cycle of the machine, and she drank it anyway. I need to ask you something, Reeves said. Ask. The procurement code in your June report. When you flagged it, you genuinely didn't know what it was. I told you I didn't. I know. I want to understand why you pushed it anyway. You'd had 4 reports go nowhere. Your supervisor was actively undermining your credibility. You had every reasonable incentive to stop filing. She looked at the bad coffee. I was a combat trauma nurse for 3 years, she said, before Ash Hollow, before all of this. She hadn't talked about that period to anyone at the hospital. It was a part of her life she'd kept in a separate compartment because it was easier that way, and because people asked questions about it that she didn't always have good answers to. I spent those 3 years working in conditions where the difference between enough supplies and not enough supplies was the difference between someone dying and someone not dying. When I got to Ash Hollow and started seeing inventory numbers that didn't add up, I knew what missing supplies meant in practice. Not abstractly. I knew what it looked like when someone needed a trauma kit and the shelf was short. She looked at him. So I kept filing because I knew what the gap cost, even if I didn't know why it was there. Reeves was quiet for a moment. You should have been read into this 6 months ago, he said. It was as close to an apology as she suspected he came. You didn't know about me 6 months ago. We knew about the reports. We found them in the suppressed record. He looked at the table. We didn't know who was filing them, or we didn't connect the name to... We missed it. We had 17 active threads, and we missed the one person inside the building who was doing the work we should have been doing ourselves. She absorbed that without inflating it into something it wasn't. People miss things. Systems had gaps. The specific gap in this case had cost her a job and 8 months and something that hadn't fully finished costing her yet. What happens now? She said. Now we document everything, process the evidence chain, and Hale gets arrested. He said it with the straightforwardness of someone describing a logistics sequence. The federal warrant covers him and 14 named co-conspirators, including Whitmore. The civilian hospital side will be a separate DOJ action. Ash Hollow's operating license is almost certainly suspended pending investigation, which means the hospital will undergo federal receivership. The board, the administrative leadership, the procurement department, all of it. His eyes met hers. You'll be contacted by the DOJ within 72 hours. Your testimony and your documentation will be central to the civilian prosecution. She thought about the hospital, about the ER corridor she'd walked 10,000 times, about Pete, the longshoreman, about the patients who'd be caught in the middle of whatever came next, the restructuring, the investigations, the institutional chaos that federal receivership produced. The patients, she said, the DOJ will require continuity of care to be maintained. The ER won't close. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. I know, he said. I don't have a better answer than that one. She nodded. It wasn't enough, but nothing in this situation was entirely enough, and she was realistic about the difference between what was possible and what she would have chosen if she'd had the option. The conference room door opened. Sims appeared, phone in hand, with something different in her face. Not urgency, but weight. The kind of expression that accompanied information that changed the shape of what you thought you were dealing with. We have a problem, Sims said. Reeves looked at her. Hale. He's not at Fort Devens anymore. He left base at 4:30 a.m., Private vehicle, no driver, no notification to base command. She held up her phone. He's in Grayport. But the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees that had nothing to do with the building's ventilation system. He knows, Claire said. Someone tipped him. Whoever it is in the network we haven't identified yet. They told him the warehouse was compromised, and they told him about the hospital. Sims looked at Claire with an expression that was carefully neutral, and therefore not neutral at all. His vehicle was last tracked on Coastal Route 9. Claire knew Coastal Route 9. She'd driven it twice a week for 8 years. It ran directly past Ash Hollow Medical Center, and then 6 miles further, past the Atlantic Shoreline Access Road, past the small 3-unit building where she rented the ground floor apartment she'd lived in since she'd arrived in Grayport. "He's coming here," Reeves said. It wasn't a question. "He's been in this operation for 3 years, Sims said. He's watching it collapse in real time, and he knows the primary evidence thread runs through one person who has both the institutional knowledge and the testimony capability to close the loop on him completely." She looked at Claire. "He's not coming for documents." The bad coffee was cold now. Claire set it down. She looked at Reeves. "Tell me you have people between that road and this building." Reeves was already on his radio. But the answer that came back in a burst of fragmented transmission that she could hear even without it being directed at her, landed in the room like a stone into still water. 2 words. "Not yet." And somewhere outside, on a coastal road in the first gray light of a Maine morning, a decorated general with 38 months of crimes and a private vehicle was moving toward the one person whose testimony could end him. And the gap between not yet and right now was the most dangerous distance she'd ever had to cross. Reeves's radio crackled again. Then it went silent. Then every light in the building cut out simultaneously. The emergency generators kicked in 6 seconds later, bathing the conference room in red standby lighting, and in the sudden crimson dimness, Claire looked at Reeves and saw on his face the specific expression of a man who understood exactly what a blown circuit breaker in a federal crime scene meant when a trained military operator was 30 seconds away. It meant someone had cut the power deliberately. It meant he was already here. Reeves moved first. He was across the conference room before the red emergency lighting had fully stabilized, his hand on Claire's arm, not grabbing, just directional. And he said 2 words into his radio that she understood were a pre-established signal because the response was immediate and coordinated rather than confused. "Stay low," he said to her, "not because you can't handle yourself, because I need to know exactly where you are." She appreciated the distinction. She moved with him. The corridor outside the conference room was red-lit and strange. The familiar geometry of the administrative wing transformed by the emergency lighting into something that felt like a different building wearing the same floor plan. 2 of the federal agents from the stairwell were already in the corridor, positioned with the instinctive tactical spacing of people who didn't need to discuss it. "Where's Patterson?" Claire said. "Lobby," Reeves said. "He's okay. The power cut was external. The main junction box is around the east side of the building. It's not a system failure." "Someone who knows building infrastructure," Claire said. "Or someone who had 10 minutes with a building schematic," Reeves said. "Which is not a difficult thing to obtain for a man with 30 years of military intelligence clearance." General Victor Hale had spent a career inside systems that provided exactly this kind of operational information. He'd requested it for legitimate purposes 10,000 times. He knew how to use it for one illegitimate purpose at 5 in the morning in a coastal Maine city where his operation was collapsing around him. Sims appeared from the far end of the corridor, moving fast, phone pressed to her ear. "Local PD has the building perimeter. 4 units. They're establishing a cordon now. State police are 7 minutes out." She lowered the phone. "We don't know his entry point yet." "He'll know where the cameras are," Claire said. Both of them looked at her. "He's seen classified facility security assessments for 20 years. He knows how hospitals position their exterior cameras, because civilian hospital security is partially informed by DHS guidelines that he helped write." She'd attended a mandatory security briefing in her 2nd month at Ash Hollow that had cited those exact guidelines. Eastside has a gap. Between the loading dock camera and the corner of the physical therapy wing, there's a 30-foot blind spot. Reeves looked at Sims. "East side," Sims said into her phone and walked. "What?" What happened next took 11 minutes in real time and felt like both longer and shorter than that, the way high-stakes time always distorted itself. Hale came in through a basement maintenance access door on the east side of the building, not the loading dock, but adjacent to it, a secondary door used by facilities staff during equipment deliveries. It required a key that the building's facilities manager had reported stolen 6 weeks ago, and that nobody had followed up on because missing facility keys in a large hospital were filed under administrative annoyance rather than security concern. He was carrying a sidearm. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, dark trousers, the kind of outfit that was designed to read as anonymous in the same way that the SUVs in the hospital parking lot had been designed to read as anonymous. And he moved through the building's basement level with the purposeful quiet of a man who had spent decades practicing purposeful quiet in difficult environments. He was 61 years old and he moved like he was 45, and he was heading for the stairwell when Reeves's team intercepted him. Claire wasn't there for that part. Reeves had her in the second-floor conference room with one federal agent and explicit instructions to stay put, which she followed because she understood the tactical logic and because her legs had finally cashed the check her adrenaline had been writing for the past 6 hours. She heard it, though, or heard the shaped absence of sound that indicated something had resolved below her, the specific quiet that followed containment rather than the different quiet that followed something worse. Reeves's voice in her earpiece. "We have him. He's secure." She put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 4 seconds. Then she stood up, because there was still more to do. General Victor Hale in person was different from the photograph Sims had shown her. The photograph had been institutional. Metal ribbons, pressed uniform, the public-facing version of authority that 2 decades of Pentagon press offices had carefully maintained. The man they brought up to the second-floor conference room under armed escort was the same face, the same silver hair, the same military bearing that didn't entirely dissolve even in handcuffs. But there was something stripped from it, the institutional surface, maybe, the assumption of protection. He looked at Claire the way people looked at things they hadn't expected to find in their path. She looked back. There was a long history of men like Victor Hale looking at people like Claire Donovan and not seeing anything worth calculating. She'd understood that for most of her adult life had built a professional methodology around it. Document everything, be precise, be persistent, let the work speak because the work could be measured, and you sometimes could not. She'd applied that methodology inside the military system and then inside the civilian hospital system, and in both cases the work had spoken and the wrong people had been listening. He was the reason her record had been quietly buried when she'd left military medicine. She understood that now, fully, in a way she hadn't before tonight. The classified mission that had ended her military nursing career, the one where she'd raised questions about supply allocation to a forward field hospital and been told the questions were above her clearance level and then been strongly advised to pursue civilian opportunities. That had been the first time Hale's operation had brushed against someone who was paying attention. She'd been too junior to be worth neutralizing directly. Easier to just ease her out and let the institutional machinery handle the rest. He'd probably forgotten her within a week. That thought was not the satisfying thing it might have been. It was just true. "Ms. Donovan," his voice was measured. Whatever he was feeling, he'd had enough practice at control that it stayed below the surface. "I assume you've been very helpful to these people." "I did what I know how to do," she said. "Document accurately and tell the truth. They'll build a case around your testimony," he said, as if she hadn't spoken. "You understand what that means, that you'll be in the middle of this for years. Federal prosecution at this level isn't a quick process." "I know what federal prosecution looks like," she said. "I've read the case files on military medical supply fraud that didn't go far enough because the evidence chain was incomplete. I always wondered why those cases stalled." She paused. "Now I know." Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite, but its second cousin. The acknowledgement of someone who knows they've been accurately read. "Reeves," he said, pivoting away from her, "you know how this plays out. My attorneys will argue chain of evidence issues on the warehouse material. The hospital documentation is circumstantial without a direct financial link. The drive's decryption methodology will be challenged. We have 104 transactions over 38 months with your cipher on the authentication chain," Reeves said. "Your attorneys are welcome to argue whatever they want." Hale's jaw worked once. What's on that drive was compiled under operational authority. The classification doesn't cover financial fraud, Sims said from the doorway. She had her phone in her hand and the expression of someone who'd been waiting to deliver a specific piece of information and had now arrived at the moment. The DOJ reviewed the decrypted contents 40 minutes ago. They've issued warrants for 14 individuals. Your name is on the primary warrant. She held up the phone so he could see the document header. That's a federal arrest warrant, General, not a military proceeding. This goes through civilian federal court. The distinction mattered because military proceedings had different leverage points, different evidentiary standards, different appeals pathways, all of which Hale's legal team would have mapped out in advance as contingency planning. Civilian federal court with civilian federal evidence standards was a different architecture, one his contingency planning was less designed for. She watched him understand that. It didn't take long. He was not a stupid man. He'd run a complex criminal operation for 3 years without detection, which required genuine intelligence and discipline. Watching that intelligence turn inward and assess the situation with accurate pessimism was its own particular thing to observe. "I want my attorney," he said. "Already contacted," Reeves said. "You'll have access within the hour." They walked him out. He passed Claire again in the doorway, and this time he didn't look at her, which she found more interesting than if he had. The next 4 hours were documentation and debrief, which was its own kind of exhaustion, the grinding, procedural exhaustion of formal processes that required precision when your body wanted to stop. Claire gave her statement to a DOJ attorney named Hargrove, who was thorough and humorless, and wrote everything down twice, and she walked him through the 8 months of reports and the June procurement code and the warehouse and the photographs and all of it in the flat, detailed language of someone who'd spent years documenting things and knew how to be useful to a record rather than expressive for an audience. Hargrove asked her at one point whether she'd understood the legal risks of entering the hospital building that morning. "I understood them," she said, "and you went in anyway." Someone was destroying evidence. He wrote that down. "In your assessment, was there a less legally ambiguous way to address that situation?" She thought about it honestly. "Probably not in the time available," she said. The window between Whitmore entering the building and the warrant being executable was a gap that the evidence wasn't going to survive. I made a judgment call. "Based on?" 8 months of watching accurate documentation get buried, she said. "I wasn't willing to watch it happen again." Hargrove wrote that down too. Sims found her at 9 a.m., sitting on a bench in the main lobby with her third cup of bad hospital coffee, watching the morning shift arrive to a building that now had 3 federal agencies processing its administrative wing and a Grayport PD presence at every entrance. The morning nurses and techs and orderlies who came through the staff entrance did so with the slightly stunned expressions of people arriving at work to find their building had become a news event overnight. The ER was still running. Hargrove had been right about continuity of care. Whatever happened to Ash Hollow's administration and license status, the clinical side kept moving because patients didn't schedule their emergencies around federal proceedings. Claire could see the ER entrance from where she sat, and there was already a small backup in the waiting area, normal for a Tuesday morning. She wanted to go in, not for any strategic reason, just because that was what she did. That was where she knew how to be useful. She stayed on the bench. She was not currently an employee of this hospital, and the legal situation around her presence was already complicated enough without her walking into the ER and treating patients on a suspended credential. "Hale's attorney arrived," Sims said, sitting beside her. "He's been advised of the evidence summary." The attorney immediately requested a meeting with the DOJ team. She paused. "That's not what you do when you think you can win." "He's looking for a deal," Claire said. "He's looking for reduced exposure, which means he's going to give us the 14 named co-conspirators with more detail than we have from the drive alone, and probably 2 or 3 additional names we don't have yet." Sims looked at the ER entrance. "He'll try to argue cooperation credit. Will he get it?" "Not on the primary charges. The evidence is too complete." Sims was quiet for a moment. "There's something you should know. The operative who died in the warehouse last night, his name was Daniel Forsyth. 29 years old. He'd been with our unit for 3 years. Claire said nothing for a moment. "Does his family know?" "They were notified this morning. She thought about Daniel Forsyth, 29 years old, in a warehouse full of stolen medical supplies. She thought about the kind of death that happened inside classified operations. Unannounced, without public acknowledgement, the family receiving a visit from people in civilian clothes who explained as little as they could while still being technically truthful. She'd known people who'd received those visits. "The drive he recovered," she said. "Yes," Sims said. "The drive with the full operational record, the one that gave us everything. He pulled it from the previous site before the situation went loud. That was his last operational action." She paused. "The decrypted contents are the foundation of every warrant issued today." Daniel Forsyth, 29, had carried the evidence that was currently dismantling a 38-month conspiracy, and he'd done it in the last minutes of his life without knowing whether anyone would ever extract it. She held that. She didn't try to compress it into something more manageable. "The nurse they all dismissed," Sims said quietly, "was the only civilian in the building who knew what that procurement code meant. If you'd stopped filing reports in February, if you'd let it go when the fourth one went nowhere, we'd have the drive and no way to decrypt it. Tanner's team confirmed this morning that without the fragment in your June report, the reconstruction would have taken weeks we didn't have." Claire looked at her coffee. "I wasn't being heroic. I was being stubborn." "Most useful things are," Sims said. Maset. At 11:30 a.m., Hargrove found her in the lobby and sat down with a tablet and a formal expression. "I need to inform you of some developments," he said. "First, your termination from Ash Hollow Medical Center is being reviewed as part of the conspiracy investigation. Specifically, the performance case constructed against you has been identified as potentially fabricated to provide legal cover for the dismissal. The patient complaint that formed the basis of that case, we've located the patient. They have no recollection of filing a complaint and deny doing so. She'd suspected something like that. Suspected it and then pushed the suspicion away because there was a version of events where it was true and a version where she was simply a nurse who'd been unlucky, and the version where it was true required the world to have been a specific kind of deliberately cruel in a way she'd found easier to not fully believe. The world had been exactly that deliberately cruel. Second, Hargrove said, General Hale's attorney has provided additional information regarding your military service record. Specifically, the classified mission that preceded your departure from military nursing. He looked at her over his tablet. There was a formal adverse notation placed in your record by a senior officer who was acting under Hale's direction. That notation, which categorized your performance on that mission as below standard, has been identified as fraudulent. We'll be initiating the formal correction process. The break room at midnight with Karen Stoltz and the badge on the counter. The military medicine office where she'd been quietly advised to pursue civilian opportunities. The years of carrying a record that told the wrong story about who she was. All of it. How long for the correction process, she said. 90 days for the formal record amendment. Your clearance reinstatement, if you choose to pursue it, would take somewhat longer. He paused. I've been asked by Agent Reeves to convey that the SIU would consider it a significant asset if you were willing to discuss a formal consulting arrangement. That's not my department. I'm just passing the message. She looked at the ER entrance again. A paramedic unit had just pulled up, fast, 2 techs already moving with a gurney. Automatic doors, bright interior light, the noise of organized emergency briefly audible before the doors closed again. Tell Reeves I'll think about it, she said. She meant it. She was already thinking about it. Hargrove left. Sims had drifted to the other end of the lobby to take a call. Reeves was somewhere in the administrative wing, still managing the evidence processing. Claire sat with the quiet that settled when everything you'd been bracing against finally resolved. Not peace exactly, more like the specific exhaustion of a structure that had been under pressure for a very long time and had finally been allowed to rest. Things that had been wrong for months were in the process of being corrected. People who had caused specific, deliberate harm were facing specific, proportionate consequences. It wasn't a clean feeling. It never was. Real resolution didn't feel like the end of a story. It felt like stepping out of a thing you'd been inside for so long you'd forgotten it had an exterior. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number, but the area code was Virginia, D.C. corridor, where federal agencies clustered. She picked up. Ms. Donovan, a woman's voice. Formal, precise, the cadence of someone who gave briefings for a living. My name is Director Harlan. I'm with the Defense Accountability Office. I've been monitoring the situation in Grayport since approximately 3 a.m., and I've reviewed Agent Reeves's preliminary report. All right, Claire said. I'll be brief because I imagine your morning has been sufficiently long. I want to discuss General Hale's full record with you. Specifically, I want to discuss a pattern that extends beyond the supply diversion operation you've helped us expose. A pause. We believe this is not General Hale's first operation of this kind. Claire went still. What you've uncovered in the past 8 months, Director Harlan continued, maps onto a pattern of behavior going back approximately 9 years. 3 prior instances, all smaller, all handled internally in ways that allowed him to continue. The people who flagged those instances, the director's voice was careful, measured, all encountered career disruption shortly afterward. 2 left military service, 1 transferred to a civilian role. 1 is deceased, officially from natural causes. The lobby was very quiet around her. Morning light came through the glass front doors, the particular flat white of a Maine morning after a foggy night, and it fell across the floor in a long, pale rectangle. You're telling me this wasn't the first time, Claire said. No, and the individuals who noticed the earlier instances, we want to revisit those cases. With your help, and with the evidence chain from today's operation, we believe we can establish a pattern that changes the entire scope of the prosecution. The director paused. It also means there are people whose records, like yours, need to be corrected. People who raised the right questions at the wrong time and paid for it. Claire stood up from the bench. The nurse from the second instance, Harlan said. The one who left military service 9 years ago. She's currently working in a civilian hospital in Maryland. She doesn't know that what she reported was part of something larger. She doesn't know her departure from military medicine was engineered. The director's voice took on a particular quality. She should know, and she should have a choice about what she does with that knowledge. The morning shift at the ER entrance. The paramedic unit that had just pulled in. All the ordinary urgent machinery of a hospital doing the thing hospitals existed to do, continuing through everything else. Send me what you have, Claire said. All of it. Every case. We'd like to do that in person, Harlan said, given the sensitivity. When? I can be in Grayport by this evening. Claire looked at the pale morning light on the floor. I'll be here, she said. She hung up. Reeves was standing at the edge of the lobby, having materialized in the particular way of people trained to arrive at things quietly. He'd clearly heard at least the last exchange. Harlan called you directly, he said. It wasn't a question. She did. That means she's expanding the scope. He studied her. You understand what that means. It's not just today's case. It's 9 years of cases. I understood her, Claire said. It'll take years. The full investigation, the record corrections, the testimony. I know what years look like, she said. I've been doing this for 8 months with no backup. I can do it with backup. He looked at her for a moment. Not recalibrating this time. She thought maybe he'd finished recalibrating sometime in the last hour and had arrived at a stable assessment. Marcus is out of surgery, he said. He's stable. He's going to need about 4 months of recovery. Tell him I said he's welcome, she said. The ghost of something crossed Reeves's face. Not quite a smile. The shape of one, maybe. He went back to the administrative wing. Claire stood in the lobby with her cold coffee and her phone and the specific knowledge that she had agreed, in the space of a 2-minute call, to walk back into the largest and most complicated situation she had ever been part of. Not as a victim of it, not as someone trying to survive the edges of it, but as someone positioned at its center who knew exactly what she was looking at and why it mattered. The director was coming tonight. The full file was coming tonight. And somewhere in that file was the name of a nurse in Maryland who had done the same thing Claire had done 9 years earlier and had lost the same things Claire had lost, and didn't know yet that she hadn't lost them alone, and hadn't lost them for nothing. Claire's phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown Virginia number. The same area code as Harlan's call. A single image attachment. She opened it. It was a photograph. Grainy, clearly a copy of a copy, the edges softened with age and compression. A military medical unit, somewhere overseas by the background, maybe 12 people in frame. She scanned the faces the way she always scanned groups, left to right, systematically, the way you scanned a wound for the source of the bleed. She found what she was looking for in the third row. A woman, mid-30s in the photo, surgical mask down around her neck, looking directly at the camera with the expression of someone who'd been through a long shift and wasn't performing anything for anybody. Dark eyes. A set to her jaw that was familiar in the way that a specific posture was familiar. Not the person, but the quality. The quality of someone who had been through something and was still standing and had decided that standing was enough for now. Below the photograph, a message from Harlan's number. This is who we need you to meet. Her name is Sandra Reyes. She doesn't know we found her. She doesn't know about today. She doesn't know about you. Claire looked at Sandra Reyes' face in the photograph for a long moment. Then she looked up at the ER entrance, where another ambulance had just pulled in, where the ordinary urgent work of keeping people alive was proceeding on its own unbroken logic, and where, she understood now completely, she was always going to end up, one way or another. She typed back, "I'll be ready when you arrive." She hit send, and across Grayport, in the administrative offices of Ash Hollow Medical Center, federal agents were loading boxes of evidence into vehicles while Drew Whitmore sat in a holding room and waited for his life to be reconstructed around what he'd done. And at a military legal processing facility, General Victor Hale's attorney was presenting the opening position of a cooperation argument that the federal prosecutors would spend the next 72 hours systematically dismantling. And in a military hospital recovery room, Marcus was breathing on his own for the first time in 6 hours, with a vascular repair that held. All of it in motion simultaneously, all of it connected to a nurse who'd kept filing reports after everyone told her to stop. But there was one thing none of them knew yet. Not Reeves, not Sims, not Hargrove, not Director Harlan herself. Something that was in the files being prepared for tonight's meeting. Something buried deep in the records of the second case 9 years earlier, the case Sandra Reyes had stumbled into and been pushed out of. A name in the authorization chain. Not Hale's name, a different name. Someone who had approved the internal suppression of Reyes's report at the time, and who had since moved, not out of military service, not into private life, but up. The file that was coming tonight would show that the person who had signed off on burying Sandra Reyes' report 9 years ago was now sitting on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and they had been briefed on today's Grayport operation at 6 a.m. 4 hours ago. The name in the file was Senator Dale Morrow. Claire found it at 7:14 p.m., sitting across from Director Harlan at the same conference room table where she'd drunk bad coffee and watched Victor Hale understand he was finished. Harlan had driven up from Boston in a government sedan with 2 aides and a physical briefcase that she'd carried herself, which said something about how seriously she was treating the chain of custody on what was inside it. The aide who'd printed the 9-year-old authorization chain had highlighted the relevant signature in yellow. Unnecessary. Claire had found it herself before the aide could point to it. She had a nurse's eye for anomalies in a record and a name at a suppression authorization that belonged to a junior military liaison who had since become a 3-term senator with a seat on the committee that oversaw the Defense Logistics Agency, the same agency Hale had commanded, was the kind of anomaly that didn't need highlighting. She looked at Harlan. He was briefed on today's operation at 6 this morning. Yes. Which means he knew we were moving on Hale before Hale knew. Yes. And you're telling me this at 7 in the evening, Claire said, which means you spent the day deciding whether to tell me at all. Harlan had the grace not to deny it. She was a compact woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses she kept taking on and off. And she had the specific quality of someone who was very good at their job and very clear-eyed about the limits of what their job could accomplish. I spent the day confirming the authorization chain was what the document suggested it was. I didn't want to bring you incomplete information. Is it complete now? It's confirmed, Harlan said. Dale Morrow, then a GS-15 military liaison, signed the internal suppression order on Sandra Reyes's report 9 years ago. The order was routed through Hale's office, and Morrow's signature appears as the secondary authorization, which gave it the interagency weight to close the inquiry without a formal investigation. She set her glasses on the table. At the time, Morrow was positioned as a reformer. He'd built his early career on government accountability messaging. He was protecting Hale's first operation, Claire said. We believe so. We believe he received something in return. We're still tracing the financial connection, but there's a pattern in his early campaign finance records that the FBI's Public Corruption Unit flagged this afternoon when we ran the cross-reference. Reeves was standing by the window. He'd been there since the briefing began, saying very little, which she'd come to understand was his mode of operating when the information was significant enough that adding commentary felt disrespectful to it. He's been informed of Hale's arrest, Claire said. It wasn't a question. He issued a statement at noon calling it a sad day and expressing confidence in due process, Harlan said. He's been on 2 classified intelligence briefings this afternoon. He chairs the subcommittee that would normally oversee any expansion of this investigation. The structure of it was almost elegant, in the way that well-constructed corruption was always almost elegant. Each piece positioned to protect the pieces around it, the whole thing self-reinforcing. Morrow on the Oversight Committee meant that any investigation that tried to climb high enough to reach him would have to pass through an architecture that he had partial control over, almost elegant, almost. Sandra Reyes, Claire said. Does she know about Morrow? Not yet. She knows we've made contact. She knows it's about an investigation connected to her military service. She doesn't know the specifics. Harlan paused. She's willing to talk. She's been willing for 9 years. She just didn't know who to talk to, or whether it would matter if she did. Claire thought about that. 9 years of carrying something accurate with nowhere to put it. 9 years of knowing a thing was wrong and having no mechanism to make the wrongness count. She'd had 8 months of that. 8 months had been enough to change the shape of her life. What do you need from me? She said. Your testimony establishes the current operation, Harlan said. Reyes's testimony, combined with the 9-year-old authorization chain, establishes the pattern. Together, they create a record that survives Morrow's oversight position because it predates and postdates it simultaneously. She leaned forward slightly. But there's a practical problem. Morrow knows we have Hale. He doesn't know yet how far the documentation goes. When he finds out, and he will find out because these things move, he'll use whatever committee authority he has to slow the expansion of the investigation. We have a window. How long? 48 hours before his staff connects the 9-year-old record to the current case and brings it to him. Possibly less. Claire looked at the highlighted name on the document. Dale Morrow. 3 terms in the Senate. A reputation for tough questioning of military contractors during public hearings, which she now understood was the specific performance of a man who needed to be seen asking the right questions so nobody asked the right questions about him. What do I have to do? She said. Fine. She called Sandra Reyes that night from her apartment, which she'd returned to for the first time in what felt like a week, but was actually closer to 19 hours. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. Jacket on the chair, half-empty glass of water on the counter from the night before. Her medical text stacked on the kitchen table in the particular order that meant she'd been studying for something she'd now probably never take. The phone rang 4 times before a woman picked up and said cautiously, "Hello?" "Sandra," Claire said. "My name is Claire Donovan. I was a combat trauma nurse before I was a hospital nurse, and 9 years ago, someone buried your report to protect an operation you stumbled into, and I have the documentation that proves it. I want to talk to you about what we can do with that." A long silence. "How did you find me?" Reyes said. "The same way they found me. I kept filing accurate reports until somebody noticed." Another silence. Shorter. Something shifting in it. "You said we," Reyes said. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not doing this alone," Claire said. "Neither am I. Neither of us ever should have been." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Claire sat on her kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets because the chair felt too formal for what they were actually doing, which was 2 women who had never met reconstructing the parallel architecture of what had been done to both of them and figuring out what to build from the remains. Reyes was 39, she learned. She'd been working as a civilian trauma coordinator at a hospital in Maryland for 6 years, having left military nursing under circumstances that had been explained to her as a performance issue, and that she'd spent 9 years knowing wasn't true and being unable to prove. She had a daughter named Maya, who was 7 and who was apparently asleep in the next room for most of the call, which gave the conversation a specific quality of hushed urgency that Claire found unexpectedly moving. "I filed 3 reports," Reyes said, "over 4 months, each one more detailed than the last, because I thought the problem was that they didn't have enough information. I thought if I gave them enough specific data, they'd have to act." "I did the same thing," Claire said. 53 reports in 8 months. 53. A breath. "Did it work?" "It worked differently than I intended," Claire said. "But yes, it worked." She told Reyes the shape of what had happened. The warehouse, Marcus, the drive, Hale's arrest, Morrow's name in the authorization chain. She kept it factual and didn't editorialize because Reyes didn't need interpretation. She needed information, and she was clearly someone who could handle information and draw her own conclusions. "He signed the suppression order," Reyes said when Claire finished. Her voice was very controlled, the kind of controlled that took effort. "Yes." "And now he's on the oversight committee." "Yes." Another long silence. "My daughter was born 6 months after I left military nursing," Reyes said. "I left because the environment had become hostile and my record had been compromised and there was no pathway forward. I left because I thought I'd failed." Her voice did something briefly complicated and then steadied. "I have been telling myself for 9 years that I should have stayed, that I should have pushed harder, that if I just—" She stopped. "You did everything right," Claire said. "They were bigger than what any one person could push against alone. That's not your failure, that's their design. Knowing that doesn't fix the 9 years. No," Claire said, "it doesn't." She didn't try to make that less true. Some things didn't get softer just because you finally understood them. "Will my testimony help?" Reyes asked. "Your testimony closes the pattern," Claire said. "Without it, Morrow argues the 9-year-old authorization was a routine administrative decision made by a junior official. With it, it's the first link in a documented chain of deliberate suppression that ran from the first operation to the current one. The pattern is the evidence." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "And the 48-hour window?" "Yes." "I can be in Grayport tomorrow morning," Reyes said. "I need to arrange Maya's school pickup." It was such a specific, ordinary logistical concern in the middle of something this consequential that Claire almost laughed, not dismissively. She felt the full weight of what it meant to say, "I will help dismantle a senator's cover story, but first I need to sort out school pickup." "I'll make sure there's somewhere comfortable for you both to stay," Claire said. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Claire said. "I want to." Fixed. Sandra Reyes arrived at 9:30 the following morning with a rolling carry-on and a 7-year-old who looked at the federal agents in the lobby of the DOJ's temporary Grayport field office, set up in a rented space 3 blocks from Ash Hollow, with the frank, evaluative stare of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't assessing people. Reyes herself was quieter in person than on the phone, in the way of people who process things inward before expressing them outward. She shook Claire's hand and held it for a moment longer than a standard handshake, looking at her with dark, steady eyes, and didn't say anything, because there wasn't a sentence that was going to capture what that handshake meant, and she apparently knew better than to try. Maya sat in the corner of the field office's waiting area with a book and a snack her mother had packed, and Claire watched her periodically over the course of the morning because there was something grounding about the presence of a 7-year-old in a room full of federal proceedings. Maya had no investment in any of this except that it concerned her mother, and watching her read her book with the total absorption of children who had not yet been taught to perform attention was a specific antidote to the institutional gravity of everything else. Reyes's deposition took 4 hours. She was, Claire observed through the glass partition, a remarkably effective witness, not because she was dramatic, but because she wasn't. She answered questions with the precision of someone who had spent 9 years reviewing the events in her own memory and had long since separated what she knew from what she inferred. She cited specific dates, specific report numbers, specific names in the notification chain. When the DOJ attorney asked her to describe the conversation in which she'd been advised to leave military nursing, she described it in exact language, including the specific phrase used by the officer who delivered the message, a phrase that appeared word for word in Hale's internal operational notes about managing personnel who were observing anomalies. The attorney underlined it twice. By 2 p.m., the DOJ had enough to formally expand the investigation to include Senator Dale Morrow under a sealed inquiry that would run parallel to the Hale prosecution. The sealed nature of it meant Morrow's committee authority couldn't be used to interfere before the evidence was locked. The 48-hour window had been enough, barely. Harlan found Claire in the hallway outside the deposition room. "It held," Harlan said. "Yes." "You understand that the Morrow piece is going to take considerably longer than the Hale case. Sitting senators have significant legal resources and procedural protections." "I know," Claire said. "I have time." Harlan looked at her with the appraising quality she'd had since their first meeting, the look of someone taking accurate measure. "Reeves submitted a formal recommendation for your consulting engagement this morning. So did I, independently." She paused. "You'd be working within the Defense Accountability Office's investigative framework, specifically on medical supply chain integrity, identifying irregularities, building the evidence base, liaising with clinical staff who may have observed anomalies without understanding their significance." "Like I was," Claire said. "Like you were," Harlan said. "Except now you'd know what you were looking for and you'd have the institutional backing to do something about it." Claire thought about it. Not the romantic version of thinking about it. Not the narrative where she said yes immediately because it was the obviously right thing and the moment called for it, but the actual version which involved thinking about what it would cost and what it would require and whether she was actually built for it, not in the crisis mode way she'd demonstrated over the past 30 hours, but in the sustained, grinding, unglamorous way that real investigative work actually operated. She was 31 years old. She'd been a combat trauma nurse. She'd spent 8 months filing reports that nobody wanted to read. She'd kept a man alive on a warehouse floor with field gear and muscle memory. She'd walked into a building in the dark knowing 2 unauthorized people were inside and done it anyway because the alternative was watching evidence disappear. She was not fearless. She was afraid of things constantly. She'd been afraid for most of the past 30 hours, and she'd been afraid for most of the past 8 months. And she'd been afraid during her military service for stretches of time that she still occasionally revisited in the particular way you revisited things that hadn't fully resolved. But fear had never been the thing that stopped her. What had stopped her, when she stopped, was not knowing that her work mattered, not knowing that someone was receiving it, filing into a void and wondering each time whether this was the report that finally proved she was wrong to keep trying. That part was over. "Yes," she said. "I'll take the engagement." The formal charges against Victor Hale were filed on a Thursday, 6 days after the Grayport operation. 112 counts: federal fraud, conspiracy, illegal diversion of government property, obstruction. The indictment was unsealed at 10 a.m., and the announcement came from the DOJ's main press office in Washington, which meant it ran on every major network by noon. Claire watched it on her laptop in the small hotel room she'd been staying in while her apartment was being treated as a peripheral evidence location. There'd been surveillance on the building they'd found, going back 4 months, which was its own thing to absorb on top of everything else. The press conference was brief. A DOJ spokesperson read the charges. Behind her, projected on a screen, was a summary of the diversion operation: scale, timeline, estimated value. $40 to $60 million in diverted military medical supplies over 38 months. 14 co-conspirators charged. A network spanning military procurement and civilian hospital administration. The spokesperson did not name Claire Donovan. That was by design. Her formal cooperation status meant her name stayed out of the public record until the prosecution team determined it was tactically useful to release it. She'd agreed to that. She wasn't interested in press conferences. What she was watching for was Hale's face, which the cameras found when he was walked into the federal courthouse in a dark suit with his attorney beside him, and the particular expression of a man who had spent 30 years being publicly important and was now being publicly something else entirely. He didn't look at the cameras. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was seen, just over his shoulder as he entered the courthouse, a cluster of uniformed military officers who'd gathered on the steps. Not supporters, Their body language was wrong for that. They were there to witness, to be present at the specific public moment when a man who had worn the same uniform they wore was being walked into a federal building in handcuffs. She understood that. There was something in collective institutional witnessing that served a function. The acknowledgement that this happened, that someone who operated under authority had corrupted it, and that the institution itself was choosing to see that rather than look away. She closed the laptop. Drew Whitmore's plea agreement was entered 11 days later. He cooperated fully in exchange for reduced sentencing, which meant he gave the prosecution every financial record, every communication, every contact name he had. His testimony corroborated and extended everything in the recovered documentation. His attorney called it a difficult but necessary decision. The federal prosecutors called it comprehensive. Karen Stoltz, who had managed the operational suppression of Claire's reports at the hospital level and had built the fraudulent performance case, was charged separately under a conspiracy count that Whitmore's testimony supported. She had apparently been receiving payments through a shell account for 18 months. The amounts were not large, which said something about the specific economy of what she'd sold and what someone had decided it was worth. Ash Hollow Medical Center entered federal receivership. The board was dissolved. The administrative leadership structure was removed. A court-appointed administrator took operational control while the hospital's licensing status was reviewed, and the DOJ issued a public statement clarifying that patient care would continue uninterrupted throughout the process. It was not a clean process. Receivership never was. The clinical staff who'd had nothing to do with the corruption spent months in the uncertainty of working for an institution whose future was being decided in courtrooms, and some of them left, and the ones who stayed did so under circumstances that were more difficult than they should have been. That was a real cost, paid by real people, and it was part of the bill that Whitmore and Hale and all the others had run up without ever intending to pay themselves. Claire thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. The distributed cost of institutional corruption, how it was never contained to the people who designed it, how it spread through the building, the system, the daily lives of people who were just trying to do their jobs, in ways that couldn't be fully accounted for in any prosecution document. She thought about Pete, the longshoreman with the crushed fingers. She hoped his follow-up care hadn't been disrupted. She had no way to know. Her military record was formally corrected on a Tuesday afternoon in December, which was not a ceremonial occasion. There was no presentation. She received a secure electronic notification from the Defense Records Center with an attached document showing the amended notation, the removal of the fraudulent adverse entry, and a formal statement that the prior notation had been placed in error under circumstances that constituted a violation of military personnel protocol. She read it twice. Then she put her phone down and made herself a cup of tea she didn't really want and stood by the window of her new apartment. She'd moved because staying in the surveilled building had felt like remaining inside a story that was over, and looked at the Grayport waterfront in the December gray. The bay was the color of pewter. A container ship was moving in the channel, slow and enormous, heading for the open Atlantic. She watched it until it cleared the headland and was gone. The amended record didn't give back the 8 months. It didn't give back the 3 years before that, the military nursing career that had been quietly deflated by a fraudulent notation. It didn't give back the specific version of her life that she would have had if none of this had happened. She was 31 years old, and she had a corrected record and a consulting engagement with the Defense Accountability Office and a colleague in Maryland named Sandra Reyes, who texted her approximately every 3 days with updates on the investigation's progress, interspersed with photographs of Maya doing things that 7-year-olds did. Last week it had been a drawing Maya had made of what she described as the nurse who helped Mama, which was a generous portrait in crayon that bore no particular resemblance to Claire, but had clearly been produced with significant enthusiasm. Claire had put it on her refrigerator. It was not everything. It was also not nothing. She went back to work in January. Not at Ash Hollow. That institution was still in the long process of being reconstituted. And even when it emerged from receivership, it would be a different building than the one she'd spent 8 years inside. She picked up per diem shifts at Harwick Community Hospital, 12 miles up the coast, because she needed to be doing clinical work alongside the investigative consulting, or she didn't feel fully like herself. Reeves had asked if the dual role was too much, She'd told him it was the right amount. Harwick was a smaller facility than Ash Hollow, with a smaller ER and a different rhythm, and she spent the first 2 weeks recalibrating to the specific acoustic and spatial grammar of a new hospital the way you calibrated to any new environment, systematically, without rushing, letting the pattern establish itself. On her third shift, she caught an inventory discrepancy in the trauma supply cabinet. It was small, 3 units of a specific wound packing material that should have been restocked 4 days earlier and hadn't been. Probably a logistics delay. Probably completely unremarkable. She documented it anyway. Filed a formal notation in the supply management system with the specific item code, the expected restock date, and the current shortage quantity. Flagged it for the supply chain coordinator. The charge nurse at the station next to her watched her do this and said, mildly, "You know that's probably just a shipping delay." "Probably," Claire said. "So why?" "Because probably isn't definitely," Claire said. "And the documentation costs me 3 minutes and might matter to someone eventually." The charge nurse considered this. "You're going to be one of those nurses who documents everything, aren't you?" "Already am," Claire said, and moved on to her next patient. Senator Dale Morrow resigned from his committee positions in February, citing personal health reasons, which was the language that people used when their personal health reasons were a sealed federal investigation that their attorneys had advised them was no longer possible to outrun. The resignation was reported as a surprise by outlets that hadn't been tracking the pattern. It was not a surprise to anyone who had. The sealed inquiry was unsealed 6 weeks later, in the second week of March, and the announcement came from the same DOJ office that had announced Hale's charges. This time the press conference was longer. The spokesperson named specific counts: conspiracy, obstruction, misuse of official position, campaign finance violations connected to payments received from entities linked to Hale's network. The financial connection that Harlan had suspected was documented in full. Over 9 years, Morrow had received just over $2 million in obscured payments routed through 4 different financial vehicles. He resigned from the Senate the same afternoon. There were photographers outside his Washington office. He walked to his car with his head down and his attorney's hand on his arm, and the photographs that ran the next morning showed a man in a dark coat with gray hair and the expression of someone who had made a very long series of calculations and arrived at the wrong answer every single time. Claire saw those photographs on her phone while she was on a break between shifts at Harwick. She looked at them for about 10 seconds. Then she put her phone away and went back to work. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd thought she might feel triumphant, had anticipated it the way you anticipated the feeling of putting something very heavy down after carrying it for a long time. What she actually felt was something quieter and less defined. The recognition that a process that should have existed in the first place had finally run its course. That was less exciting than triumph. It was also more honest. Marcus Riley, she'd learned his last name eventually, from Reeves in one of their operational briefings, completed his recovery ahead of the projected timeline, which his medical team apparently attributed to being approximately twice as disciplined about physical therapy as anyone had anticipated. He was 33, she learned. He'd been with the SIU for 4 years. He'd been a competitive swimmer before military service, which probably explained the vascular surgeon's comment about exceptional baseline cardiovascular health in a patient who'd had catastrophic blood loss. He came to Grayport in April. She met him at a coffee shop on the waterfront because it seemed like a more reasonable location than any of the official venues that had contained all her other conversations about these events. He was bigger in person than she'd registered from the warehouse floor. When you were working on someone, you were working, not observing. And he walked with a slight compensation in his gait that would probably resolve over time and might not entirely. He sat down across from her and looked at her with the direct, unguarded quality of someone who'd been in enough situations where pretense was useless that they'd stopped bothering with it in daily life. "I don't know how to do this correctly," he said. "I've been trying to figure out what you say to the person who kept you alive." "You don't have to say anything specific," she said. "I was doing my job." "That's what Reeves said you'd say." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "He also said you'd probably try to redirect the conversation to operational logistics within 5 minutes." "He's not wrong," she admitted. Marcus looked at her. Not the way people looked when they were assessing or calculating, the way they looked when they were just seeing. "Thank you," he said. "That's the whole thing. That's all I've got." She nodded. "You're welcome." They talked for an hour, not about the operation, or not only about the operation. He told her about the swimmer thing. She told him about the first time she'd kept someone alive in conditions she hadn't been trained for, on her second deployment, in the back of a moving vehicle with insufficient equipment, with the specific feeling of having to solve a problem in real time using only what she had and what she knew, and the not knowing whether it was going to be enough. "That feeling," he said, "does it go away?" "No," she said, "but it gets familiar, and familiar is workable." He nodded. Like that was the useful answer, not the comfortable one, and he knew the difference. In May, the Greyport ER nursing staff collectively nominated Claire Donovan for the Maine State Nurses Association's annual Clinical Excellence Recognition. They did it without telling her, and the first she heard about it was when the MSNA sent a formal notification to her registered address. She read the nomination letter, submitted by the Harwick nursing staff on her behalf, with signatures from 12 colleagues she'd worked alongside for 4 months, and felt something that she didn't have a precise clinical term for. The particular feeling of being seen by the people whose seeing meant most, because they were the ones who understood what they were looking at. She'd worked alongside these 12 people for 4 months. She hadn't told any of them about Ash Hollow, or the warehouse, or the federal case. She'd shown up, done the work, documented accurately, treated patients with the full attention they deserved, and been the kind of colleague who noticed when the supply cabinet needed restocking and said so. That was what they'd nominated her for. The ordinary version of the same thing she'd been doing all along. She submitted the acceptance of the nomination on a Wednesday afternoon and then drove to the waterfront because she needed the open air. The Atlantic in May was a different substance than the Atlantic in October. The light different, the cold different, the smell of it carrying something that was almost but not quite warmth. She parked and walked down to the water and stood on the rocky shore with the wind moving her jacket and the waves coming in at their usual indifferent pace, and she thought about what she had and what it had cost, and whether the math worked out. It didn't, really. The math never worked out on these things if you tried to balance it like a ledger. You couldn't put 8 months of professional erasure on one side and a consulting engagement and a corrected record on the other, and call it even. You couldn't put 3 years of military nursing built on a fraudulent adverse notation and Sandra Reyes's 9 years of carrying something accurate with nowhere to put it, and say that the prosecution's compensated. People had died. Daniel Forsyth was dead. Patients across multiple institutions had been affected by supply shortages that fed an operation none of them had ever heard of. Marcus walked with a slight compensation in his gait that might or might not resolve. Sandra Reyes had spent 9 years telling herself she'd failed. None of that was erasable. But Claire had also learned something in the past 7 months that she hadn't fully understood before. And she was standing on the shore of the Atlantic in May, turning it over in her mind the way you turned over a stone to see what the light did to it. She'd spent years believing that the work she did either mattered or it didn't, and that whether it mattered was something that other people determined. Supervisors, institutions, authorization chains, men behind desks with the authority to decide which records stood and which got quietly buried. She'd believed that her job was to do the work correctly and hope that the people receiving it would receive it correctly, and that when they didn't, the failure was somewhere in her. She'd been wrong about that. The work had mattered every single time. The June report with the procurement code fragment. The 53 variance reports that mapped the diversion timeline. The 3 photographs taken in a dark office before a man could stop her. The 11 minutes on a warehouse floor that kept a person's heart pumping long enough for the next thing to happen. Every one of those had mattered. The fact that the people receiving them had been actively working to make them not matter didn't change what they were. A true thing was still true while someone was trying to bury it. Accurate documentation was still accurate while someone was deleting it from the Active Directory. The corruption had been trying to erase a record. It had never succeeded. It had only ever delayed it. She was the reason the delay ended, and she hadn't done anything extraordinary to make that happen. She'd done the thing she'd always done, noticed what was wrong, documented it precisely, and refused to stop because she knew what missing supplies meant in practice. The ordinary version of her, the one who'd been dismissed as exhausted and ordinary, had been exactly enough. That was not a comfortable lesson. She'd have preferred a version where she was remarkable in some clear way, where there was a specific skill or gift that had made the difference. The actual lesson was less satisfying and more durable, that the difference between things changing and not changing was often just someone with accurate observations and the stubbornness to keep making them. There was a version of this where she'd burned out earlier, where she'd stopped filing in March, when the fourth report went nowhere, when the exhaustion of fighting an institutional wall with paper felt genuinely futile. She'd almost stopped. She'd sat in the break room on a Tuesday in March and thought about stopping, and then she'd gone home and slept and come back and written the next report. Not because she'd known, not because she'd seen what was coming or understood what she was holding. She'd done it because the alternative was letting a wrong thing stay wrong while she had the capacity to do something about it, and she hadn't been able to reconcile herself to that. The ordinary stubbornness of someone who knew that gaps in supply cabinets had names, real people who needed what should have been there. That had been enough. She stood on the shore until the light started to change, until the afternoon softened toward evening and the water picked up the first traces of gold that preceded sunset, and then she walked back to her car. Reeves had sent her a briefing package that morning about a new irregularity flagged in military medical supply distribution in the Pacific Theater. 2 separate clinical officers at 2 separate facilities had filed reports in the same 6-week window, noting that trauma supply restock rates didn't match their order records. Small discrepancies. The kind that could be data entry errors, the kind that could be something else. He'd attached a note. "You're probably going to want to look at this." She started the car. She pulled out of the waterfront lot and drove back toward Harwick, where she had a shift in 3 hours and a briefing package to read before it. And the Atlantic stayed visible in her rear-view mirror for a long time before the road curved inland and the water disappeared behind the tree line. She didn't look back when it went. She was already thinking about the next report. Some stories end with a medal and a press conference. This one ended with a nurse reading a briefing document before a shift in a car that needed an oil change, thinking about supply chain irregularities in the Pacific Theater. It ended with a woman who'd been told she was ordinary deciding that ordinary was never the insult they'd meant it to be. It ended the way most actual justice ends, not with a clean line, but with a tilt, a shift in who holds the weight. The people who believed she was disposable were sitting in courtrooms. The people who needed her to stay quiet were losing their committee positions and their freedom and their carefully constructed public stories. And the nurse they'd all decided was nothing kept showing up to work. That was the whole thing. That was enough.